Ford here on episode 24 of the SoulBuffalo Earth Report podcast. We're so excited to have our friend, Global Policy Manager for Plastics at the World Wildlife Fund, Mr. Eirik Lindebjerg. Did I get it?
Yes, that's great. Thanks a lot, Dave, and thank you for inviting me to be here. It's really a great pleasure to be with you from far away from Norway.
From Bergen, Norway, and I just looked that up on the map, and you are on the west coast of Norway, sort of a long, slow stone's throw to Scotland, to northern Scotland.
Exactly, long sailing trip, rather, but yeah, that's right.
Nice. Yeah, I woke up this morning in upstate New York with 24 inches of snow in our yard. What's it like in Norway right now?
Yeah, I'm a bit disappointed that you've stolen all our snow for Christmas. It's way too hot here. I think we have 10 degrees Celsius and a bit rain outside. So crossing fingers for a colder Christmas.
Oh, well, it's definitely no joke here. So if any of this weather is heading your way, which I think it might with the Gulf Stream, you'll be in good shape.
Great.
We're so excited. I mean, we announced last week with Aaron Simon from your World Wildlife team here in the U.S. and John Hocevar from Greenpeace, the Global Treaty Dialogues, which is we are hosting a year-long worth of dialogues to help map understanding and consensus leading up to a big United Nations Environmental Assembly vote about a year from now in February 2022, where the world is going to decide if we're going to pursue a Paris Accord for plastics. So we'd love to hear about your work and how you started working on this issue specifically. And we're just going to deep dive and, hopefully take everybody on a journey of what it takes, to go from, a year before a vote about a big global treaty and kind of what we need to do. And, certainly a need to harmonize the world around this issue.
Great, thanks, Dave, and it's really exciting to be part of that as well. And for us in WWF, this started a couple of years ago when we started realizing. I mean, we have projects working on plastic pollution in all corners of the world, and we work with businesses, we work with governments and local communities, and it was a realization in our network that this is truly a growing global environmental issue. And when we then started to look at what exists at the global level, how is the global community coming together to solve this crisis, what we found was basically nothing. And the UN as well has done this kind of assessment and looked at the global legal framework for tackling plastic pollution. And it is essentially a big black hole full of gaps. And as a global community, we don't have that common platform and that common framework for tackling this issue that we need for such a, what is in many ways an accelerating global issue. So really, from that on, we've seen a growing recognition and the plastic pollution problem, I think, in people's minds as well, have gone from this sometimes aesthetic problem on your local beach to really being acknowledged as a full life cycle major environmental issue. And along that journey, a lot of governments as well have come out to support the need then for a global treaty, like you say, a Paris Accord for plastic pollution. We do have these global treaties and conventions on all other issues, and actually you could say that even though a treaty itself alone won't solve the entire problem, but at the same time there hasn't been ever a global environmental problem that has been solved without a global treaty in place. So it's a necessary piece of the puzzle. And that's, we have it for ozone depletion, we have it for biodiversity loss, we have it for climate, but it is then clearly lacking for plastic pollution.
It's true. And it's just so impossibly complex, this issue. There's just so many stakeholders. There's so many types of plastic. And I think one of the big things that we really needed to root into when we decided to host this dialogue is to make sure it was very inclusive, because this isn't, this problem, certainly on everyone's beaches, but it's really hard hitting in the global South, the developing world. It's just like, 2 billion people today don't have any waste collection. So they're forced to burn, they're forced to illegally dump, they're forced to do whatever they can do to get rid of their waste. And there's nothing but more population growth supposed to, in the next 20 years, is supposed to take that right now projected to take that 2 billion people to 3.7 billion people without any waste management. So it's like, now is the time. And we're seeing all of this data coming out that's pretty scary. And when you have such a diverse range of stakeholders, across the map, from the value chain, from the plastic value chain, and thousands of companies and different types of companies that are relying on plastic, and you have, the 193 UN member states that all have a different sort of understanding and a way and approach, and so many different NGO groups. There's a super confused consumer. And then the 15 billion people that are collecting waste out of landfills and out of the environment in the developing world that need this plastic waste to take to recyclers to feed their families. It's crazy. Can you tell us, like, how did you get on this journey personally? How did you start to become, the global policy plastic expert, or one of the top experts at the World Wildlife Fund?
For me, I think personally, I've always had this strong commitment and passion and desire for making an impact and a difference for the environment. So my educational background is from international affairs related to the environment. I worked with UN Environment Program, started working with WWF on different issues, like the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, was one of the first things I worked with at WWF. And coming from a coastal town in Norway, from Bergen, I've always been physically close to the ocean, but I guess also emotionally linked to it. So working on protecting the oceans from what is really a huge upcoming disaster, in a way, felt very right. And then with my work with the UN Environment Assembly, we identified also this opportunity that now is the time really to get in place a new treaty on plastic pollution. And then naturally, I would say, Dave, I kind of transitioned into that role, and I then became the global leader for the WWF network, working for that. So both academically and emotionally attached to the issue, I would say.
How we got started at SoulBuffalo was taking senior leaders from big companies on expeditions and getting them sort of boots on the ground in Antarctica and Greenland for climate change. So like Fortune 50 companies taking 30 of their top leaders to Antarctica. And we did a lot of wildlife conservation work, and we would immerse leaders in the anti-poaching initiatives in Zimbabwe. And I was in India. I don't think I've told you the story. I was in India, and we did a big human wildlife conflict in southern India with like tigers and elephants. And on the way back through Delhi, I got some university professors to take me on a waste tour. And this was like 4 or 5 years ago, and it was like totally, plastic was in the zeitgeist, but it was like before the straw was up the turtle's nose. It was before like everyone was talking about plastics, and it was like an everyday headline. And I did this day tour of Delhi, and like this, it was emotional. I mean, like these giant mountainous landfills, on the outside of town, and just seeing all these people, digging through the trash, pulling plastic out, and just how bad some of those areas were, it just hit me at a really core level. And that's how we got into this. After that, we booked a ship and took 165 leaders out into the middle of the Atlantic Gyre and had the Ocean Plastic Leadership Summit. And that's where we, deepened our relationship with Greenpeace and World Wildlife Fund and built this trust really across the value chain, which was really interesting. but it is emotional. And I think so many people have emotional, experiences with plastic, because you can feel it. And that's where I think there's hope, because with, 25 years that it took for the Paris Agreement to pass. I mean, not for a lot of reasons it took, but for a lot of that time period, there's just a lot of disagreement about whether it was an issue. And what we have here in the plastic, there's no disagreement. Like, everyone knows, industry, activists alike know that this is a really big issue. In your conversations with different governments, can you give us a sense of like who are some of the like leaders, or maybe, and I know there's some surprising countries that are leading the way, like Rwanda, but we'd love to like the countries that are really leading the way on this. We'd love to kind of dive in there.
Yeah, definitely. I think the leadership on this issue comes from many corners of the world, and for different reasons, right? I think the Pacific Island states, for example, were some of the first countries who really spoke up for this. I mean, they're already out there in the boat near the gyre. They can see the plastic floating into their beaches. They know that only a small part of it been emitted from their own countries. They immediately see with their own eyes that we cannot solve this issue without international cooperation, right? They were early on leading the race. Then there are countries in Southeast Asia who are experiencing already the large impacts at scale, both social impacts, economic impacts, and also the environmental impact. So Vietnam, for example, Philippines have clearly spoken out for the need for a global agreement. And I think those are some of the countries who are really feeling this issue at the moment. Then we see it, rapidly growing plastic pollution issue and problem also in Africa. And I think your example of Rwanda is a very good one. They've taken some drastic measures to reduce pollution domestically, and then also come to a realization that those measures won't be as effective as they could be without international cooperation. So they've been leading the way a bit in Africa as well. And we see more and more African countries speaking out on the issue. Ghana recently as well did that. And then there's Europe. The European Union have taken some important measures over the last years, and have now also in their circular economy action plan committed to take a leading global role to get in place this global agreement on plastic pollution. So I guess they will be leading then with all these other leaders, right? So there are many of them, which I think is a very good thing. But again, also, I mean, I think we've counted now, it's about a bit more than like 65 countries who have publicly come out and committed to the idea, which means that there are a lot of countries left as well. And there's a lot of work still to be done, and a lot of countries sitting on the fence trying to figure out, is this, do we really, I think it's much down to is, do we really dare to commit ourselves to actually be part of the solution?
So, and then the UK just came out and said that they were generally, one of their sort of lead environmental ministers just came out and said they were on board, which was like a pretty big win, right? Like that wasn't necessarily expected.
Exactly. No, that was, and it was a very clear statement, and it was a statement that both spoke to the urgency of the problem, that we need to get this done now, and it spoke to the ambition. We need to get an ambitious and effective global agreement, not just sign a paper just for signing the paper. And I think that's where also our treaty dialogues also come into place.
Yeah, totally. Right. I mean, you look at, there's the what, where there's actually a lot of agreement that as far as like the structure, right? These three major reports came out in 2020. The first being the business case for a global treaty, which was put out by the World Wildlife Fund and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And there were 30 plus Fortune 500 companies that signed up for the idea, supported the idea of a treaty. Really incredible report. And we'll link all these reports in the recap of this podcast. There is a government treaty that came out by the Nordic Council of Ministers, who I want to meet this Nordic Council. Do you actually know the Nordic Council of Ministers? Because they sound like a pretty cool group, and I would like to at some point in time meet some of these folks.
Yeah, no, definitely they are, and they've been in the forefront for a long time. And I think their advantage of the Nordic countries is that they all have a quite similar mindset, and so they can easily agree among themselves, and that means that they can also start thinking more into detail and explore an issue as a group of countries further. Which has led them then to already put out a report on some potential elements of a global agreement.
And I read 148 pages. I read them all. I'm super proud of myself, but it was an easy read. I mean, it's fascinating. And they put out what really a framework could look like, what could be included, what they think should be included. That was really, really amazing. We'll link to that too. And then the last report that came out a little earlier in the year was from the Environmental Investigation Agency, Gaia, and CL, which is the environmental NGO perspective on why we need a treaty. That is backed by Greenpeace, that's backed by Break Free from Plastic movement, and it breaks down like general framework. And, just to quickly not get too into the weeds, but, the idea of like monitoring and reporting. So like harmonizing definitions of all these different categories across all these countries. Because right now everyone's speaking a completely different language around the world with respect to this. Varies so much from region to region. And then how do you environmentally monitoring this? How do we share and report on data? Like, what are the national action plans, right? Like, similar to the way the Paris Agreement is set up, right? So that's sort of like the first pillar. Then the second pillar would be this, like, what the prevention efforts would be, like sort of the global plans, how we tackle microplastics versus nanoplastics. How do we standardize labeling, right? Like, that's like a big thing. Like, how do you know what piece of I'm looking around for plastic on my desk, like different types of plastics are and how you can recycle them, because it differs widely. In the US, I can't recycle a clamshell strawberry container where I am, but two towns over they can, and in New York City they can. So it's really interesting, like just regionally, and it gets so complicated there, right? Then it's like coordination. So how do we work with other agreements, like the Basel Agreement that tackled the amendment that just passed this past year that talks about how to like bring transparency to the global plastic waste trade, and MARPOL Annex 5, which prevents illegal dumping from ships. And how does this infuse with climate change, right? Because there's clear correlations between the plastic issue and the climate issue. If we have dead oceans, it's not going to be good for the climate, right? So, and then finally, like the technical piece, like how do we assess progress and who's playing the bank for, there's so much that needs to be discussed. But I think generally the framework seems to be agreed upon. What's in the treaty, totally different, right? You have, environmental, the environmental report is definitely pushing for plastic reduction as a whole, which, is definitely lots of industry groups don't agree with that approach. Then on the flip side, the industry groups are really pro, advanced recycling technologies and different ways to handle all this plastic waste that's ending up in the environment. And there's, definitely like a lot of challenge from the environmental groups there. But I think, in generally, there's this like infusion of like hope and optimism that once we get on this journey and once we start to drive on this, like both collectively what we're doing with the global treaty dialogues, but just, with the world, as we start talking about this, that we can do something and that this problem is solvable. What are your,
definitely, Dave, and I think that you see a lot of the conversion there, also around some elements that they make so much logical sense. It's such a huge cost not to harmonize your reporting standards, for example. And as we point to in the business case for a treaty report, there's so many even direct costs that businesses face today with having to comply with completely different approaches, reporting methodologies, legislation in all the countries that they operate. So we're creating a chaos that is not necessarily useful for solving the problem. So there's a ton of things that could be done much more efficiently if they're done together and across and harmonized. And then, so just there, it's an obvious case for harmonization. And then if you want to lift the ambitions a bit, you want to actually solve this problem and not just, do a tiny bit of thing more effectively, then you definitely need to have that global alignment and agreement on lifting the ambition, and pressure also for all governments to come along, so it's not ends up being a couple of leading countries and companies bearing all the cost and don't get the rest of the world with them. So I think, from there comes this, what you rightly point out to, that there already exists quite some similar ideas of what is needed, both in the business community, NGO community, and among some of the leading governments on this.
You talk about treaties and speed, and I think when you run into like a pessimistic human that maybe has been involved with this in the past, this type of process in the past, that one of the big objections were like, oh, these things like can take forever, right? I mean, I don't think anyone's saying that we should stop driving action to solve all these myriad of problems along the way, but that this framework could address the bigger picture, understanding, and sort of give the world like an operating blueprint of how to handle this. But you mentioned something interesting before we got on the show, just about, things can happen fast if there's political will. Can you dive into that a little bit more? I mean, it's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, no, I think that the argument of time is something that, of course, to a certain degree, it's valid. If you want all the actors, all the governments in the world to agree to something, of course it will take time, because some will have a problem with one issue, some you have to adjust and you have to negotiate. So that process, of course, takes a little bit of time. But really, if it will take 1 year or 10 years, or I guess 25 years, that is completely a function of political will. If the government leaders want this to happen fast, then it will happen fast. So sometimes I get with politicians who using it as an argument. Oh, this will take so much time. Well, it won't take much time if you prioritize it. So I think that's an important aspect, and we've seen example of that in the past, right? For example, the Montreal Protocol, like huge ozone depletion becoming a huge problem, becoming a political priority for many countries as they saw the risk of cancer really becoming very evident in the 80s, and put together an effective treaty in 1997 that now we can say 30 years later has actually solved the problem. And we saw it also with the Framework Convention of Climate Change. Now, it took a long time before the Paris Agreement was added to that agreement, but before the Rio Summit, 1992, there was a clear drive to get global treaties into place. There was a political pressure to get it done by that summit. So they managed to negotiate in just 1 or 2 years, Framework Convention on Climate Change, Framework Convention on Biodiversity, and on desertification. So, there are many other examples, and also from different fields than the environment as well. International cooperation doesn't have to be this thing dragging on for decades. There's enough political will, and if there's enough push for it, then it can happen in 1 or 2 years.
So it's interesting. We have this like 12-month win. Well, we're going to kick off the global treaty dialogues. It looks like, because of some big meetings that are happening in early March. And we're going to have like a year to bring stakeholders from all over the map. So across the industry, from the petrochemical sector to big consumer packaged good companies, to retailers, to waste management companies, all these different industry groups, and then environmental groups and activist groups. And, I'd say most importantly, folks on the ground in the global South, in the developing world, where this issue is, already like a crisis that, and I think most people have probably at this point have seen some of the beaches in Southeast Asia and Indonesia and the Philippines and Sri Lanka and India. I mean, it's bad. But it's so important to have that piece front and center, and to have those players, just be like a really key partner here. Like, what do you think? I know we're all going into this with an incredible amount of optimism, but like, we're a big fan over here of like the obstacle is the way, right? And like there's a lot of big challenges that once overcome can really like forge the path forward. What do you maybe say? What do you think are some of the biggest obstacles, and what are you most optimistic about? When we chart this journey next year together.
Yeah, I think you touched upon it earlier, that around questions around reduction, around chemical recycling, around new technologies. There will be differences when you bring together the petrochemical industry with strong environmental activists, with the people on the ground that are really experiencing the consequences of this. But I think that's that's the way to go as well. I mean, I think that the push on the world's leaders and the heads of state for them to really, understand and take on board what is needed. I think that one voice alone from any of these groups would really have the impact, and that is what I think one really important aspect of this, that we're able to bring together all these communities and unite around and put on the table, this is the areas where we really think that a treaty should be designed to make a difference. And I mean, now the whole UN process was put on hold for a year due to COVID. The big decision-making moment was supposed to happen then in February 2021. That was postponed because of COVID. So, let's take that gap that's created and use it rather. I mean, use the big crisis and get some positive out of it as well, and use it as an opportunity to actually bring in all these actors and all these people that normally aren't the ones that are negotiating global treaties, right? But now with the global treaty dialogues, we're able to bring their voices also into the mix and hopefully find some common ground that can set the direction then for the negotiations between governments that will then kick off a year from now.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear too. I mean, like as we're holding all these conversations, we truly believe like tension equals progress, but we're not trying to do any pre-negotiations. We're really just trying to map where everyone is thinking, and as best we can, I have this vision of like country negotiators getting, tell me if I'm wrong, just giant binders like thrown on their desk like 2 months before they have to vote on something, right? And then they have but if over the course of the year, we can invite them into a process where they can hear from all sides and just learn more, like certainly from like an education perspective, but also to like have deep conversations and dialogues, and then to have the same sort of conversations happen with, the industry and the activist groups and the waste collectors, the people that are actually, picking plastic up off the beach. Like that's our mission here, like to bring all these different stakeholders together. There's just so many. So can't tell you how excited we are to be on this journey with you guys, together with World Wildlife Fund and with Greenpeace, like two of the biggest environmental campaigning organizations in the entire world. Do you have any final? We're right at time here, but I'd love to. If you have any final thoughts, Eirik, I'd love to hear them.
No, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Dave. And we're really excited too. And I think going back to that emotional link that we started talking about, if we're able to bring that also to all the decision makers and bring the connections between the heads of state and the waste picker, then that's how I think we're going to make a global difference, because I'm pretty confident that we are going to change the world with this. So thanks a lot, Dave.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Eirik. And again, so grateful to be working with you guys on this. Well, that's a wrap, everyone. SoulBuffalo Earth Report podcast number 24. Just super grateful to have you on, Eirik. We are going to be back on next week. I think we have one next week before Christmas, but we'll send out information on that. But yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation, and let's do this again soon. I'd love to, honestly, Eirik, if we could do this regularly and just update on the process. You're so deeply dialed in on all fronts here. Would love to make this a regular thing.
Great, thank you. I'll be happy to be back anytime.
All right. Well, we'll let you head back in Bergen, Norway, and have a great day, everyone. Really appreciate it.